Hi, everyone. I think we'll get started. Sorry to put an end to that excellent music and Courtney's excellent dancing. But I'd like to welcome you to the second session of Pandemic Storms, Pause, Reflect, Act, the UVic Faculty of Education's COVID-19 Research Symposium, taking place every Wednesday in May from noon to 1 p.m. And thank you for joining us today. My name is Tanya Battersby. I'm the Research and Grants Facilitator for the Faculty of Education, and I'll be facilitating today's session. And I'd like to begin by respectfully acknowledging that UVic is located on the traditional territory of the Lekwungen peoples and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. So a couple of housekeeping issues before we begin. I think that we're all pretty Zoom literate by now, but just a reminder to keep yourself muted unless you're speaking. And if possible, keep your video on, because for the presenters, it's nice to see people's faces when they're speaking and know who they're talking to. If you run into any trouble using Zoom during the session and you need technical support, please feel free to ask for help in the chat. We have Courtney here. Courtney can give us a wave, yeah, as well as Hector, and they're both providing technical support so they can help you with any troubleshooting with any issues with Zoom that may come up. And finally, we will be recording the presentation today, and you'll receive a notification from Zoom when the recording is starting and ending. And then the recordings will be posted on the event homepage for viewing after the session. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's first presentation. The title of the presentation is The Role of Self-Regulatory Competencies in Mediating the Impact of COVID-19 Distress on Academic Success. And our team of presenters includes Dr. Allyson Hadwin, Dr. Paweena Sukhawathanakul, Ramin Rostampour, and Michelle Bahena Olivares. And they wanted me to share a brief description of their team with you. Together, our research team examines instructional tools and practices that promote strategic adaptation in the face of new challenges or situations. This is often referred to as self-regulated learning. We are particularly interested in processes, factors, and practices that contribute to successful academic experiences and outcomes. Welcome, Allyson, Paweena, Ramin, and Michelle.
Okay, I think I'll ask Ramin to share the slides, maybe. I'll just as the slides are getting ready to go up, I think my whole team actually live, work, and play on the traditional lands of the Lekwungen people. Speaking peoples. And we really recognize that we're fortunate at the University of Victoria to have continued opportunities to learn with and from the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships continue with the land and with the university to this day. So just to get started, throughout this pandemic, one of the things that I've really tried to focus on are the gifts of COVID. And I want to say that this project and the opportunities it's created to collaborate with this awesome team have been one of those incredible gifts for me. So we were very fortunate to receive the COVID-19 Emergency Grant Fund that stimulated this work, and it truly has been a collaborative piece of work. I want to particularly acknowledge Paweena, who's played such a pivotal role in keeping this project moving and keeping us organized and on track, and really been a driving force conceptually as well. So thank you, Paweena. I'm not going to speak for long. I'm just going to introduce the project and turn it over to the team. So the purpose of our study was really to examine the role the pandemic plays in post-secondary students' academic lives. And we are particularly interested interested in mental health, academic challenges, and academic outcomes. So aside for this is that we are interested in the role self-regulated learning practices play in these COVID experiences and outcomes. And we were particularly interested in the experiences of first semester students who were navigating university from a distance for the first time during this pandemic. I'll just highlight that the findings that we're presenting today are our preliminary findings. We're still actually waiting for the registry GPA information, so we are relying quite heavily on self-reported or expected GPA, and we'll talk a little bit about that as things move on. So I'll pass it over to, I think, Paweena is first.
Great. Thank you so much, Allyson. Can you just go back to the previous slide, Ramin? Perfect. Thank you. I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction to why this is an important topic to pursue. And I don't have to remind you that the pandemic has really introduced considerable disruptions to the academic experiences of post-secondary students. And early on in the pandemic, StatsCan conducted the survey of over 100,000 students, post-secondary students, and found that 26% of students indicated that their education was disruptive in some way. And of those who reported disruptions, almost all reported that their courses moved online. 26% here said that their courses were canceled or postponed, and 10% were unable to complete their courses. So the pandemic has really shifted the way students interact with course content, interact with their instructors and their classmates. Can you go to the next slide, Ramin? Thank you. And the pandemic has also really exacerbated the economic burden of students. So in addition to kind of restructuring their academic experiences, post-secondary students also report considerable financial strain. And early on in the pandemic, post-secondary students said they were extremely concerned or very concerned about their financial situation, even after the Canadian Emergency Student Benefits were announced. You can see here that 73% of students were using up their savings and having to take on more student debt. This is from the same survey of over 100,000 post-secondary students conducted by Stats Canada. And then almost half of students who had jobs or job prospects lost their job or were temporarily laid off during the pandemic. Next slide, please. And in terms of their mental health studies, the kind of increasing studies that you see about COVID-19 show that post-secondary students report high levels of anxiety, low mental health well-being, particularly during the pandemic. They also experience increasing worries related to their income, housing, and also lots of uncertainty regarding their social and health welfare, which likely exacerbate academic challenges. And we also see that there's emerging evidence to show that this might impact their academic performance and engagement. But we really know very little about the nature of these academic challenges. And we'll go into a little bit more detail about that. So next slide, please, Ramin. So what we know about academic engagement and performance is that it's a very multifaceted construct. So academic functioning doesn't just involve your grades, which is typically what is represented as academic performance. But academic success involves engagement as well, which include things like how you're monitoring or evaluating your learning process, what kind of studying strategies you're using, time management. And in fact, we see that research has identified a range of these factors that affect academic engagement and performance. So for example, some of the challenges that students encounter during their academic work can be metacognitive challenges or factors, which include things that are related to your planning or your monitoring of tasks. And then there's motivational factors as well, things that influence your will or your desire or confidence to kind of exert effort in your studies. and kind of persistence when in the face of challenges or when things are getting difficult. And then we have behavioral and management strategies, which involve strategies that you use to structure your learning environment, like time management or preparing for your exams. And then cognitive factors, which are more related to your actual learning, remembering of course content. And then the social emotional factors, which are kind of interpersonal relationships, health, mental health and your well-being. Test anxiety can be part of that as well. And we know that COVID-19 has really introduced unprecedented contextual factors that students have to cope with, in addition to academic challenges that are already inherent to their post-secondary education. So they've got this extra worry that they have to deal with. And so our study really specifically focused on understanding how social emotional factors like psychological distress that are related to COVID-19 can influence students' academic engagement and performance. Study, so next slide, Ramin. Thank you. So we conducted the study involving undergraduate students, and we wanted to gauge their level of academic engagement and performance. And we assessed for the COVID-19 related distress as well. We collected data in the fall after reading week of fall 2020. And the total amount of participants that we gathered were 496 total. And there were 3 different ways that we collected data. We recruited students who were enrolled in a learning strategy library, which is a free resource that's available through the Brightspace page. And maybe we can tell you a bit more about that at the end of the presentation if you like. We also recruited through the psychology participation pool, where students get credit for their participation in the study. We also recruited students who were enrolled in a university accredited learning strategies course called EDD 101, which my colleague Michelle will tell you more about later on in this presentation. Now, just a note that the students who were enrolled in EDD 101 were mainly first-year students. So in our results, when we're comparing between the groups, we only selected first-year students in the psychology participation pool, just in order to make it comparable with EDD 1 students, which yielded a smaller sample of 94 and 83 respectively. So we'll go to the next slide. Thank you. So we first wanted to understand how intrusive worries or distress about COVID-19 impacted students' academic functioning. And I'll tell you a bit about the measures. So next slide, please, Robyn. So we measured COVID-19 distress using a standardized scale that was developed specifically for experiences related to the pandemic, which included questions about whether students had trouble concentrating and sleeping because they kept thinking about the virus, whether they thought about the virus when they didn't mean to, so more like intrusive thoughts, whether thinking about the virus caused some sort of physiological reaction like sweating or your heart pounding, whether you had bad dreams about the virus. That's all kind of the symptoms or the questions we asked. We also included items that pertain to peritraumatic distress, which is kind of a PTSD type of measure that are related to kind of guilt or shame related to the pandemic. So feelings like feeling guilty for not doing enough to prevent the spread, or feeling ashamed of your emotional experiences related to COVID as well. Next slide, please. We also asked students to report on how often they experience various academic challenges, and these measures were developed over the years through SSHRC-funded projects, and they were based on the research that I mentioned in the earlier slide about the multifaceted nature of academic engagement and performance. So it included metacognitive, cognitive, social, emotional, behavioral, and motivational challenges. Next slide, please. And just kind of a important note here is our research project focused on the use of self-assessments that promote metacognitive awareness. And so this is sometimes called self-assessment and or therapeutic self-assessment. And these tools served as dual roles to collect, use as data collection instruments and also metacognitive interventions. And so after students fill out the survey, they also get an individualized report that gives them feedback of how they're actually faring in the different categories of the challenges that I mentioned in the earlier slide. And this is an example here. And it links, we also give them links to the strategy library where they can use resources that might be useful to them in order to overcome some of the challenges in these areas. On the next slide, please. And we wanted to first see if there was a relationship between COVID-19 distress and GPA. And again, as Allyson mentioned, GPA here refers to expected GPA. And there was, and according to our structural path analyses, the more psychological distress you have, so intrusive thoughts and worries you have about the COVID-19, the poorer you reported your GPA. However, we found that challenges specifically related to academic functioning fully mediated or explained this relationship, suggesting that one of the reasons that COVID impacted student performance is through introducing more academic challenges. But this finding doesn't really tell us about the nuances of these academic challenges. So then we examined more specifically what types of challenges contribute uniquely to performance outcomes, which brings me to the next slide. Next slide, yeah, there. And what we found is when we parse out academic challenges that were related to the different challenge areas, while globally they all contribute to the mediation, but when you account for the influence of one another, certain challenge areas become more salient. And what we found that among those 5 challenge areas, metacognitive challenges, and motivational challenges and social emotional challenges emerge as the salient challenge areas that fully mediated the relationship between COVID-19 distress and GPA. Specifically, COVID-19 related distress predicted greater metacognitive and motivational challenges, which in turn lowered expected GPA. Now, contrary to our prediction, while greater COVID-19 distress predicted more social emotional challenges, these challenges actually were associated with higher GPA. And we interpret this as that perhaps students were prioritizing academics so much so over their own health and relationships, but that they do well academically. So next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to pass the mic over to my colleague Ramin, who will tell you more about how self-regulated learning impacts the relationship between COVID-19 distress and academic functioning.
So hello everyone, and thank you, Paweena. So in this section of the presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about some basic mechanisms through which self-regulated learning impacts the relationship between COVID distress and academic functioning. So here you can see Winnie and Hadwin SRL model. So this model defines self-regulated learning as an adaptive and a strategic response to academic challenges as they arise in new learning situations. And such an adaptive and a strategic response to challenges in this model are explained by these cyclical processes represented here. So the most important message here is that self-regulated learning is adaptive and a strategic response to challenges. I'm gonna just keep it short. So let's move on to the next slide. So in this study, we use a self-reported instrument, as Paweena mentioned, to measure SRL practices, which are in fact SRL-related actions that students take. So this instrument has been developed and refined over a number of years, and it was revalidated for the current analysis to make sure that it does have psychometric adequacy. As shown in the table here, it measures different types of practices associated with self-regulated learning, such as setting goals, understanding tasks, motivation practices, motivation appraisal, task value, monitoring, time management, etc. So I'm going to show you 3 basic models to respond to the question I began with: how SRL impacts the relationship between COVID distress and learning outcome, or here GPA. this is the first model. So what we tested here was that how indirect impact of COVID distress and GPA, this, causal chain, alters at various levels of planning or planning practices. So we put planning in the model because theoretically it is a foundation of self-regulated learning practices. It meaning that investing in practices that develop planning positions students to adapt appropriately in the face of challenges. So Paweena explained the mediatory role of challenges between COVID distress and learning outcome, meaning that the more COVID distress one has, the more challenges one is likely to encounter, and the more challenges one encounters, the lower GPA they expect. This part of the model. When we added planning as a moderator, we observed that this indirect link or this indirect causal change is stronger for students who had more planning practices. And the direct impact of COVID distress on GPA is no longer significant when SRL mechanisms like planning has come into play. In the second model, we tested if the impact of COVID distress on GPA declines as students engage with more adaptation practices. And the short answer is yes. COVID distress has no significant impact on GPA for students with one standard deviation higher than average adaptation scores, while it has a significant negative impact on GPA for students who reported one still lower than average adaptation practices. So now that we went over two models explaining the importance of SRL in impacting the relationship between COVID and academic functioning, we tested if taking EDD 101, which is receiving instruction about these SRL practices, has also impacted the pattern we observed. So as Paweena mentioned, EDD 101 is a course designed to support students to learn about and develop these SRL practices over an academic semester. It also introduces them to specific strategies and techniques using a repository of strategies called Strategy Library, you can see here. So this model, which is the last one I'm gonna just introduce, tests if the impact of COVID distress on GPA declines for first-year students who took EDD 101 compared to first-year students from the SONA pool, or non-EDD 101, let's say. And the short answer is yes. COVID distress, as you can see here, has no impact on GPA for EDD 101 student. The path is not significant, while it negatively impacted GPA for non-EDD 101 students. So altogether, these models indicate that putting SRL actions into practice dampens the negative impact of COVID on academic functioning. So I think I'm done with my section. So that's your turn, Michelle.
Yeah, thank you, Ramin, and hello, everybody. Right, so we also followed up by examining the ways that first-year students in EDD 101 differ from first-year students that are not enrolled in this course and upper students through MANOVA analyses. And more specifically, we focused on the differences in their SRL practices, COVID distress, and their self-reported academic challenges. Ramin, if you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So our findings here show that there were significant group differences in adaptation and monitoring, the ones that you see there in red. And as this table shows, the post hoc analyses indicated that students enrolled in EDD 101 reported higher adaptation competencies, and this difference was statistically significant as well. Now, in terms of academic challenges, if we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So we also found that there were significant differences in their self-reported academic challenges. As this table shows, students enrolled in EDD 101 reported lower challenges in these 4 areas. And yeah, so can we go to the next? Thank you. So these are the post hoc analyses, and this table here shows that, or indicates that, students in EDD 101 report significantly less challenges compared to other students, other first-year students, and upper year students as well in these 4 areas: metacognitive challenges, social emotional challenges, and cognitive challenges. And we also see, well, or this analysis also indicates that other first-year students reported less behavioral challenges when compared to upper year students, as well as shown here in the last challenge on behavioral challenges. And on regard to the COVID scales, if we go to the next slide, please, thank you. So lastly, this table shows that we found that EDD 101 first-year students reported less COVID distress when compared to upper year students as well. And this difference was statistically significant as well. And yeah, so now I pass it on to Dr. Hadwin to address some final comments. Thank you.
So overall, our findings are quite promising. We found that COVID distress, particularly rumination, seems to impair academic functioning and performance. And in particular, it seems to magnify academic challenges. So those challenges are challenges students typically report at university when they're trying to manage their schoolwork, and the COVID distress seems to magnify those. We did find that SRL practices, particularly planning and adaptation, seem to mitigate some of the impacts of COVID-19 on these challenges and academic outcomes, such as self-reported GPA. And that the EDD 101 course that focuses really on developing those types of self-regulated learning practices does seem to make a difference. And we're still kind of unpacking those mechanisms in our analyses. So I'll just close with a couple of kind of cautions and sort of future steps in our study. We are waiting to get registry GPA. We have a strong suspicion that because of what we do in EDD 101, students in that course probably have a little bit better calibrated judgments of what their GPA is. And we have to remember that in the first semester of this first year, when everybody was using a new learning management system, I think there were many cases where students really didn't know what their marks were. They hadn't even found where to find them in Brightspace. So we're cautious about that component. We also collected some data that will allow us to examine changes in EDD 101 students from the beginning of the semester to the end. So one thing we didn't mention is we collected our data at the very end of the first semester, around week 11, but we have some earlier semester data from the 101 students, so we can see whether there was change. And then we're also replicating this study, or parts of this study, with Moira Hood, who's one of my Paweena and I's MA students, in a middle school setting. So we'll be able to see whether the same types of findings hold there. And she did some modifications of our strategy library for that particular context. We did try to follow up on students to see what happened this semester afterwards. Not surprisingly, people were pretty tired of their online worlds by the end of the second semester, and we really had trouble getting enough participants to fill out the survey again. We also tried to look at students who just looked at the strategy library, but again, we need to come up with a better recruitment strategy, I think, for that. And then finally, I just want to acknowledge just the value of truly collaborative research. So I don't think I've maybe been in a room with Paweena once, and she's been working as a postdoc on our project this whole time. Everybody else has met her, and we've worked solely online doing this. So we keep joking that it'll be weird if we're 3D in a space together. But there's just incredible value of working together. I've learned so much, and I think we've accomplished a lot through this grant because it pulled together our various interests. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Allyson, Paweena, Ramin, and Michelle for that insightful presentation. And really, this was an amazing example of how a research team looks and functions. So we have about 5 minutes for questions and comments. So I'd just like to invite anyone who's here to either type a question or comment in the chat or just write the word question or comment, and then we'll invite you to speak. So we have a comment here from Catherine. Cool, it sounds like EDD 101 can be a real advantage for students when faced with COVID, maybe suggestive of it being a tool to manage other challenges. Would any of the presenters like to speak to that observation?
I can jump in a little bit. The instruments that we used in this study, where we've really become very interested in the challenges students experience and try to navigate throughout, particularly their first year, but throughout their university experiences. And so that instrument we developed was developed pre-COVID. Actually, we've been using it on our research over a number of years. And the items in that instrument emerged from students' descriptions of what it was they were struggling with on a weekly basis. So you know, it's very consistent with what you see in the student success literature in terms of factors that contribute to challenges in academic work. And what we think is learning to respond adaptively to those kinds of challenges is really what the essence of self-regulated learning is, and it's the mark of success. I think it's naive to think students don't encounter challenges, and in fact, encountering challenges for some of these students is probably the first time they've had a authentic opportunity to exercise self-regulated learning when it really counts, right? So it's part of learning, but learning to manage those things in ways that have less impact on academic outcomes, I think, is really what the goal is.
Great, thank you, Allyson. There's a question from Trevor. So Trevor, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you, Tanya. So maybe a cliche question from a high school practitioner. Can you make any connections from the study to the high school setting? Yeah, that would be fantastic if you can speak to anything that came up or any ties that you can make.
We haven't done that research yet, but I expect we can. I think one of the challenges, you know, I'm going to speak from the EDD 101 perspective. One of the challenges that we have in teaching these kind of strategies at the high school level is for many of the students who go on to university, they are the ones who've been highly successful throughout high school. And so they don't confront the same level of challenges or challenges that feel as impactful to them during that time. When they switch to university, they suddenly have a new set of challenges that seem to have a bigger effect on their outcomes, and they're not used to that. And so I sort of see that as being a prime time to exercise self-regulated learning. And I think it's not just that transition to university. I think it's these transition moments. So if you think of the transition to middle school or the transition to high school, when you move to a new context where the expectations change, right, where the standards change and where you have to kind of reset what you do and how you approach that, those are prime opportunities to learn to self-regulate successfully. So COVID-19 might have been one of those challenges in high school. We can tell you in middle school shortly, hopefully, in a couple of months, what we see in grades 6, 7, and 8. But we didn't have the opportunity to do this in high school this year. We're open to it, though. for future.
The way that we are integrating it in middle school is through kind of a mini unit that talks about these challenges. And what we know anecdotally from the teachers is that students are craving for the opportunity just to voice, all of these challenges that they're experiencing, not just in the context of academic challenges, but distress around COVID as well. And so that opportunity to kind of integrate this mini lesson, it's both an opportunity to talk about your academic challenges, but also just social emotional challenges that they're facing in a formalized educational setting, which I think is needed during this time for sure.
And for many students, again, anecdotally, both in EDD 101 and in the data that Moira's collecting in the middle school, what we're hearing is an incredible relief, not only about being able to talk about these things, but that there's things that you can do about it, right? There are actually strategies that you can pick up on that can kind of change some of those things. And for many students, that's a relief. Right? So they don't just have to kind of feel this way, but they can acknowledge it, and there are things that they can start to do about it.
We have time for about one more question here. I just want to read a comment or a question in the chat from Patricia asking if you have anything written on the research. So if you do, maybe you could post that in the chat, and then we can give Leah the floor to ask her question. So Leah, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure, and thank you. And thank you for this study as a teacher in a post-secondary education. This has been fascinating and helpful. Motivation is what has caught my attention. I was curious in the gauges and the dials where it was, because that's a conversation I've had with several of my own students, motivation. So they know the behaviors, they know all the right things to do. They've actually attended study groups and things, but the motivation piece was difficult for some reason during COVID. The couch potato, the pajamas on, that sort of stuff. Anyways, my question is, I'm sure you haven't quite looked at this, but the difference between beginning student mind and second term, say, where we've been slogging through things a little bit. And where was that motivation after and during? You mentioned that it was really hard to even get second responses to the survey. Yeah. So I'm just curious about the motivational dip over time.
So we followed up. We did the same study in the second semester with the same, we tried to do the follow-up, continuing with people who had already responded, but we also have a new sample in the spring semester, and we haven't looked at that data yet, but we expect there's a little bit of a difference in the second semester from what we were hearing from students. So in the EDD 101 course, they're writing about their experiences regularly, and we were definitely hearing about changes there. But I do want to highlight something. So when we've been examining challenges over a number of years, and before the pandemic, I think the challenges that students commonly report are motivation and time management, procrastination kinds of challenges. Those usually are significant challenges that they report on a consistent basis over the course of a semester. So that's not unusual. I think our research is suggesting it's more magnified in this kind of context. But the approach that we take from a self-regulated learning perspective is really to understand where those motivational challenges are coming from and what you can do about them. And something that we've noted in our research is, and Ramin talked about this kind of importance of planning, which is partly comprised of task understanding, right? If you don't really understand what you're supposed to be doing, why you're supposed to be doing, what it has to do with the rest of the course or the thing that's coming next, it's more difficult, right, to engage motivation. And so that's where that cyclical process of self-regulation comes in as being quite powerful for interacting and changing. It's not just pure motivation regulation strategies they often need. It's something a little bit earlier, right, to build that foundation for motivated learning.
Great. Thank you so much for those questions, everyone, and for those answers as well from the research team. We do have a patient, so I just will wrap this up by saying there are a couple more comments in the chat, and I would invite the presenters to continue to answer questions in the chat. Thank you so much, Allyson, Paweena, Ramin, and Michelle for that engaging presentation. There's a lot of clapping in the among the participants right now. So our next presentation is actually in a video format. The title of it is Mental Health and Resilience Experiences of University Students During the COVID-19 Pandemic, Implications for Mental Health Service Delivery and Policy Development. And the research team includes Dr. Jillian Roberts, Bianca Humbert, Robyn MacMillan, and Dr. Celeste Duff. And so, as I mentioned, we have a pre-recorded video from this team, and Courtney is just queuing that up. And we will turn our attention now to this presentation. Thanks, Courtney.
Just want to check, can everybody see that well?
Yes.
Awesome, thank you.
The opportunity to present our research. I would like to acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continues to this day. Our research title is Mental Health and Resilience Experiences of University Students During the COVID-19 Pandemic, Implications for Mental Health Service Delivery and Policy Development. Our team includes Dr. Jillian Roberts, Bianca Humbert, myself, Robyn MacMillan, and Dr. Celeste Duff. While conducting our research, we found that the COVID-19 pandemic has affected the mental health of populations to different extents. The purpose of this study was to explore the lived experiences of university students from diverse communities, specifically how the pandemic impacted their mental health and resilience. University students can be identified as emerging adulthood. This can be a time rich with opportunity, choice, and exploration. However, also involving increased responsibility and challenges with educational and social progression. As a result of the current pandemic, this life trajectory for emerging adults has been disrupted and to an extent immobilized. To this end, the risk and impact of psychological distress among emerging adults, particularly those from diverse communities, cannot be understated in a time of a pandemic. We undertook this research study as there are multiple knowledge gaps. The gaps that we explored were young adults being singled out as being higher risk for mental health related distress because of the COVID-19 pandemic, there being limited research that captures university students' voices, specifically those from diverse and marginalized populations in times of a pandemic. There is as well a significant gap in the literature that addresses the impact of emergency situations on people with disabilities. I will now highlight some of the existing and supporting literature that speaks to the mental health of emerging adults and pandemic-related circumstances. The symptoms of mental illness resulting from disasters and emergency situations are intensified by measures such as isolation and reduced social supports. Social isolation increases the development of mental health disorders such as anxiety and depression. Perceived loneliness and a lack of positive connections to family and friends are associated with a higher risk of suicidal ideation. As a result of the pandemic, the life trajectory of emerging adults has been disrupted. The risk and impact of psychological distress among emerging adults are significant. The rationale underpinning our research includes the COVID-19 pandemic having exposed limitations in educational institutions' actions and resources for adapting services and/or delivery, adaptations to online learning, learning options for students with disabilities, collaborative platforms for students, and ensuring mental health safeguards are functional and accessible. That globally, the negative effects on post-secondary students from the COVID-19 pandemic is unprecedented. This current pandemic's impact on people psychologically is predicted to outlast the pandemic. For our qualitative study, in order to capture students' implicit experiences of the COVID-19 pandemic, and to specifically explore students' mental health and resilience-related experiences, our study posed two key research questions. These were, what are the mental health impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the unique experiences of undergraduate students, and what are the implications and responsibility for the university. This qualitative study was guided by interpretive phenomenology. This approach was adopted in order to facilitate a holistic lens and to capture the understanding of the lived experiences of university students in times of the COVID-19 pandemic. Seeing as the COVID-19 pandemic is a novel phenomenon, a qualitative approach was designed to lay a foundation for understanding the lived experiences of participants. This was a vital aspect to better understand how to design further study. This methodological stance, therefore, assumed that subjective experiences are intertwined with the sociocultural and political location of a person. Interpretive phenomenology, in this case, facilitated a deeper understanding of students' experiences in times of COVID-19, as well as highlights environmental contexts in which their experiences are embedded. A guiding theoretical underpinning, and in part the aim throughout the study, is the significance of resilience and how resilience can apply to students impacted by a global pandemic. The second phase of analysis in the study, therefore, applied a resilience lens. Resilience theory encompasses a protective/risk factor model. Resilience is a process of adjustment that involves the capacity to overcome trauma or tragedy and subsequently achieve a positive developmental outcome. Furthermore, resilience involves a system of positively adapting during the time of or after a significant disturbance. It is important to note that resilience is, therefore, it cannot be described as a trait. All children and emerging adults have the ability to achieve resilience, as it can be built through skill development, as well through adding strength to protective factors and lowering the significance of risk factors. Applying a resilience lens as a framework allowed for a rigorous exploration of trauma and how it can affect students. Resilience theory can be applied to understanding risks, such as pandemic behavior on the mental health of students, protective factors, as well as mediating the impact of risks. Existing research reinforces that exploring diverse fields of study with the use of resilience theory is an effective lens. This study was started at a large public university on the west coast of Canada in May 2020. The aim of this study was to elicit students' implicit experiences of the COVID-19 pandemic and to specifically explore students' mental health and resilience-related experiences. Data was purposefully gathered from marginalized groups who likely face even greater impacts of social isolation on and off campus. 7 unique voices of undergraduate students from diverse communities were gathered. Participants included those who identify as LGBTQ2SIA+, international students, students from rural areas versus urban settings, and students with disabilities. Derived from phenomenology, narrative interviews were conducted. This approach to interviewing captures participants' stories that are predominantly centered on participants' psychological insights and encourages an exploration of how participants organize their understandings of experiences as stories. The interviews were conducted via Zoom on Vancouver Island, Canada. The virtual in-depth narrative-style interviews were guided by open-ended questions. The purpose of this approach was to allow the participants to fully explore their lived experiences in a non-theoretical, descriptive manner. Aligned to an interpretive phenomenological approach, the initial open-ended research questions were tentatively posed as follows. Tell me about your experiences with unique stressors and challenges that could worsen mental health for you as a student with or without disabilities during the COVID-19 pandemic. Tell me about a time during the COVID-19 lockdown that you felt impacted your mental health. Tell me about a time you experienced loneliness during the COVID-19 pandemic. Tell me about your experience as a student identifying as during the COVID-19 pandemic. Tell me about your experiences with social isolation during COVID-19. Important follow-up questions included, what recommendations do you have for the university? What recommendations do you have for the medical system? These open-ended questions captured students' implicit experiences with COVID-19 pandemic, by offering enough space for the participants to explore and add meaning to their narrative. This approach fostered an increased understanding of needed educational responses to this unique context for vulnerable student populations. These insights and narratives can contribute directly to finding adequate supports for navigating mental health concerns at their university and community, and can likely lead to developing implementable solutions to key challenges associated with the pandemic. The analysis involved 2 stages. First, the findings were analyzed thematically. The generated themes were then analyzed from resilience lens. For the thematic analysis, to examine and structure the data, as well as to develop coding categories, this occurred in accordance with Bogdan and approach. The first step involved the researchers spending time away from the data to address biases and assumptions, which was documented in a field journal. The second step required thorough examination of the data for specific phrases, words, concepts, patterns, and ways of thinking in specific behaviors or actions expressed. 6, the coding themes developed by Bogdan and Bicklin were used, as well as the researchers defined coding units. Categories were modified and added throughout the analysis process, as well as broken into smaller coding themes and sub-themes. Overall, themes are only considered if they emerged in at least 2/3 of the interviews to indicate a trend within the data collection sample. Lastly, to ensure validity, the themes were reviewed and discussed with the principal investigator, and the final changes and edits were made on an ongoing basis. Our study found 4 protective factors: positive relationships, perceived efficacy, purpose and ambition, and sense of normality. Here is an overview of our findings. We have meta-themes and themes, which are within the meta-themes. There's positive relationships with caring adults, effective teachers in schools, positive peer and romantic relationships, intentions in existing relationships, perceived efficacy, perceived sense of control, and self-regulation, purpose and ambition, seeking purpose and certainty in goal setting, sense of normality, seeking relatedness and shared experiences, and seeking professional support for reassurance. For participants who returned home during the pandemic, a sense of stability, security, and guidance was reported. Participants not staying with family, having regular phone calls and online communication alleviated feelings of detachment and social isolation. Open communication between schools and students, scheduling, flexibility, and engagement of online materials eased feelings of worry and angst and facilitated a more conductive learning experience. Some participants had challenging transitions to online learning. The lack of reassurance, rapport, and role modeling hindered binge drinking, which heightened anxiety or depressive symptomology. Participants had an urgency to find a sense of control and structure in their lives. Adopting an optimistic and resilient mindset aided to exercise control and efficacy over the pandemic restrictions. Participants described being adaptable, preserving, and making the best out of a situation. Some participants demonstrated self-compassion, acknowledging and reflecting on the emotional and mental progress they had accomplished thus far, cultivated resilience, control, and efficacy. Participants implemented manageable goals in daily life and created healthy routines. Setting goals and reaching them generated self-confidence, autonomy, and self-determination. At the start of the pandemic, some participants fell into unhealthy habits, lacked purpose and routine, and scrutinized their own daily practices. Having goals or finding productive ways to stay occupied was fulfilling for participants. A sense of purpose for self and the new way of living was required in order to readjust, empower, motivate, and preserve. Experiences typically perceived as normal for participants were important for their well-being and mental health. When participants experienced a lack of normality, they felt overwhelmed and disconnected from their idea of reality. They experienced difficulties with integrating and making sense of their new reality. However, when the same experiences and emotions were shared with peers, family members, or professionals, participants shared that they felt more in control, had a sense of normality and acceptance of the situation and themselves. Our study included a diverse sample of students. Therefore, some students from these areas of diversity or marginality had unique experiences relating to their particular circumstances. The following findings highlight other unique circumstances and experiences that impacted students' experiences of the COVID-19 pandemic. Students with disabilities experienced a lack of support, resources, and adaptations to online learning environments. International students reported anxiety and uncertainty related to security of residency. Due to the lack of coping skills and the lack of control and structure, 57% of students reported self-medicating. Some students had coming out experiences acknowledging their sexual orientation. The following list was created by all 7 of the participants who reviewed the experiences and insights on supports, or lack thereof, from the university. Creating an ongoing and open flow of information between professors and students during online class to keep feelings of engagement for students. Creating an ongoing and open flow of information between school and students about the future. Having professors be more accessible in an online environment to compensate for the missed connection in person. Making mental health resources more functional in an online school environment. Promoting and normalizing the use of online mental health resources for students. Creating awareness of the common mental health effects COVID-19 has on students. Adapting CAL to be more online friendly and engaging for registered students. Communicating adaptations and suggestions for students who are studying in non-typical environments. Lectures and content being shared inclusively for different time zone students, such as recorded and posted videos. Improved organization of online classroom environments. This study captures the diversity, marginality, and adversity of participants' experiences which are unique to their circumstances. The psychological distress reported underscores the compounding mental health impacts the COVID-19 pandemic has had on marginalized groups of undergraduate students. This study contributes towards the limited research base and offers valuable insights, which can inform university policymakers, university administration, and public health policymakers to be better positioned to develop innovative adaptations of services and/or delivery. This study has explored the experiences of a diverse population of university students, specifically how social isolation during the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted their mental health and resilience. This study demonstrates that participants experienced a distinctive range of challenges and engaged in differing processes of adjustment to address those challenges. Aligned to resilience theory, the processes of adjustment that participants engaged in can be identified as key protective factors. Protective factors enabled participants to navigate and persevere through their complex and challenging experiences. The findings presented in this study distinctively capture the diversity, marginality, and adversity of the participants. Their experiences during the pandemic, whether that was navigating online learning, access to resources, reliance on self-medication, acknowledging sexual orientation, or safety and security of residency, the uniqueness pertaining to participants' distinct circumstances are apparent. These findings have illuminated the critical role in which protective factors play in promoting positive outcomes and mediating the impact of risk and trauma, particularly for those in diverse communities with differing identities and adversities. Resilience is indeed multifaceted, and is the product of numerous interacting processes, notably protective factors. Finally, although
That's so sad. I think it abruptly stopped.
this is a small sample of participants, these findings prove important insights which are noteworthy and can be built upon in future studies. Possible directions for future research can further explore the various areas of diversity and marginality in greater depth. In addition to the impact of indulging in risky and destructive behaviors, self-medicating practices, the impact of pandemic behavior on students with learning disabilities, and how mental illness is affected by changes and a lack of routine. I'd like to thank you for everyone's time today, and we appreciate the platform that has been provided to share our research.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jillian, Bianca, Robyn, and Celeste, for sharing those insights from your research into mental health and resilience of university students during the pandemic. And that actually concludes our presentations for today. So before we all part ways for the day, I'd like to say a special thank you to the members of the organizing committee. The team is made up of Dr. Catherine McGregor, Courtney Baldwin, Hector Vasquez, Lauren Frost, and Elaine Laberge. So thank you to all of them for their collaborative efforts in putting this together today. A big thanks to the presenters, Allyson, Paweena, Ramin, and Michelle, as well as Jillian, Bianca, Robyn, and Celeste. And we'd like to invite you all to join us again this time next week. We will have 2 more presentations. The first one is titled Teacher Candidates Learning to Teach in COVID-19 Conditions. And the presenters will be Dr. Kathy Sanford, Dr. Tanya Manning-Lewis, and Tiago Hinkle from the Department of Curriculum and Instruction. And the second presentation is titled Supporting Early Childhood STEM Education During the Pandemic and Afterwards, Examining Parents and Early Childhood Educators' Perceptions of a Digital Toolkit. And the research team is made up of Dr. Todd Milford from the Department of Curriculum and Instruction, as well as his colleagues from the University of Ottawa, Dr. Christine Tippett, Roxana Yanez Gonzalez, and Hannah Bradley. So we're looking forward to seeing you all again next week, but many thanks for being here today. And